night my husband told me he wanted a divorce, he was already packed. Not halfway packed, not I've been thinking about this packed. Fully packed, 2 suitcases and a garment bag by the front door, like he'd been planning this while I was at work, while I was making dinner, while I was sleeping next to him for God knows how long. I've been unhappy for a while, he said. He didn't look at me when he said it. His name is Owen. We've been married 6 years. We met at a pub in Waterloo when we were both too young to know what we were doing, and we'd gotten married at a small venue outside of Guelph on a September afternoon when the leaves were just starting to turn. I thought that was romantic at the time. I thought a lot of things. I stood in the hallway of our house in Hamilton and I looked at those suitcases and I did the math very quickly. 2 suitcases means he's not going to a hotel. He's going somewhere specific. Where are you staying? I asked. He hesitated. That half-second told me everything. Her name, I found out later, was Tessa. She worked in his firm's Calgary office and had transferred to Hamilton 8 months earlier. 8 months. I had cooked dinner for 8 months while she existed 6 kilometers away from my house. What I haven't told you yet, what matters more than any of this, is that Owen's mother was asleep in the bedroom down the hall when he told me. Her name is Helen. She was 68 years old, had a bad hip, early-stage Parkinson's that some days was barely noticeable and other days made it hard for her to hold a cup. She had moved in with us 2 years earlier after Owen's father passed. Owen had insisted, had said, "She's my mother, we can't put her in a home, she'd hate it there." And I had agreed because I liked Helen, because Helen was one of the few people in my life who made me feel like I was worth something. Helen and I had breakfast together every morning. I drove her to her appointments at St. Joseph's. We watched British baking shows on Tuesday nights and argued about which contestant was going to win. I knew her medication schedule by heart. I knew she liked her tea with just enough milk to turn it the color of caramel, and that she hated being talked to like she was fragile, and that she kept a photo of her late husband tucked inside the cover of whatever book she was currently reading. Owen left the next morning. Before he did, he came to me in the kitchen with a look on his face that I can only describe as relieved, like he'd been holding his breath for a long time and could finally exhale. "We need to talk about my mother," he said. I poured my coffee. "She'll need to go somewhere," he said. "I've looked into a few places. There's a good one in Ancaster. I can send you the link, but obviously I won't be able to." "I'll keep her," I said. He blinked. "Sorry?" "When we sort out the separation, I want to stay in the house with Helen. I'll take over her care completely." He stared at me for a long moment. I watched something move across his face, confusion, then suspicion, then, unmistakably, relief again. The relief won. "That's okay. That's generous of you." It wasn't generosity, but I didn't say that. The separation process in Ontario takes time. We used a mediator because Owen wanted to keep it civil, which really meant he wanted it to be fast because Tessa was already talking about them getting a place together. I had a lawyer, a woman named Karen, who had the kind of measured, calm voice that made you feel like everything was going to be okay even when it wasn't. When Karen asked me what I wanted out of the settlement, I told her the house, temporary, while we figured out the long-term arrangement and full caregiving responsibility for my mother-in-law. Karen looked at me over her reading glasses. "And financially?" "Whatever's fair under the law," I said. "I'm not going to fight him." She set her pen down. "You know you're entitled to significantly more than." "I know," I said. "I just want Helen." What I had not told Karen, what I hadn't told anyone, was that 3 weeks before Owen announced the divorce, Helen had pulled me aside after dinner and pressed something into my hand, a folded piece of paper. Her solicitor's name and number written in her careful, slanted handwriting. "I've updated some things," she said, very quietly. "I thought you should know who to call." I hadn't opened that conversation any further. I didn't want to know what she'd done or why she'd done it. It felt wrong to factor it into anything, so I didn't. Owen agreed to the settlement quickly. He agreed to everything quickly. He gave me the house for 18 months while the market did whatever it was going to do, a modest monthly support payment for Helen's care, and he signed over the old Subaru because I needed a car for appointments. At the very end of the mediation session, he slid an envelope across the table. "A little extra," he said, "for the transition. $4,000 Canadian." I looked at it and I thought, 6 years. 6 years and a sick woman he couldn't be bothered to care for himself. I put the envelope in my bag and said thank you, and I did not let him see my face when I said it. The first few months were hard in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Not emotionally. I was past the grief faster than I expected. Maybe because the grief had started long before Owen packed those bags. But practically it was a lot. Helen's Parkinson's had progressed slightly over the winter. Some mornings she needed help with buttons. She never complained, but I could see it frustrated her. That loss of something so automatic. I learned to lay her clothes out in a way that made everything easier without making it look like I was making it easier. She noticed anyway. She thanked me anyway. We fell into our routines. Breakfast, her medications at 8 and at 2. Tuesdays, the baking show. On Thursdays, I drove her to a gentle movement class at the YMCA on Mohawk, run by a physiotherapist who had a gift for making everyone feel capable. Helen always came out of those classes a little lighter. Owen texted occasionally about logistics. He and Tessa had gotten an apartment in the West End. He asked once, in a brief and awkward message, how his mother was doing. I responded factually. He didn't ask again. Helen didn't talk about Owen much. When she did, it was without bitterness, which I think took more strength than anything I was managing. "He was always going to do what he was going to do," she said once, while we were sitting on the back porch in early spring, both of us with our tea. "His father was the same way. Eventually you stop being surprised." She paused, looking out at the yard. "You're not the same way," she said, "in case you were wondering." I wasn't going to cry on the porch. I looked at the fence. "I didn't do anything remarkable, Helen. I didn't want you to go to Ancaster." "I know why you kept me," she said. And she smiled at me in a way that meant the conversation was over, but also that something had been understood between us that didn't need to be said out loud. Spring became summer. I had gone back to work full-time after taking a few weeks' leave. I do project coordination for a mid-sized construction firm, which means my hours are flexible enough that I could arrange around Helen's schedule. I was getting by, more than getting by actually. Without Owen's moods and Owen's opinions and Owen's constant low-level performance of dissatisfaction, the house was quieter and easier to breathe in. Then, in August, I got a call from Karen. "Have you heard from Owen recently?" she asked. "Not really. Why?" She told me slowly and carefully, the way lawyers tell you things. Owen's firm had opened an internal investigation. Some accounts had been managed in ways that were, at best, ethically questionable, and at worst, potentially fraudulent. Owen was one of several people under review. The Law Society of Ontario had been notified. I sat down. "This doesn't necessarily affect your settlement," Karen said quickly. "Your arrangement was finalized before any of this, but I thought you should know." I thought about the mediator's conference room, Owen sliding that envelope across the table like he was doing me a favor. "Thank you," I said, and I stared at the wall for a while after I hung up. I didn't tell Helen that night. I wasn't sure I was ever going to tell her, but a few days later, she brought it up herself. Someone from her old circle, a woman she'd had bridge club with for 20 years, had mentioned something she'd read. "Tell me what you know," Helen said at the kitchen table, hands around her tea. I told her what Karen had told me. She was quiet for a long time. Then, "How much trouble is he in?" "I don't know yet. Potentially a lot." She nodded slowly. The morning light was coming through the window above the sink, the kind of flat, gold August light that makes everything look older than it is. Helen looked very small and very steady at the same time. "He took money from clients," she said. "It wasn't a question." "It looks that way. They haven't formally charged anyone yet." "His father had a weakness too," she said. "Different kind, but the same shape. She wrapped both hands around her mug. You know I changed my will. You mentioned you gave me your solicitor's name. I didn't ask. I know you didn't. She looked at me directly. Everything goes to you. The RRSP, the GICs, the cottage up in Muskoka. I've left him something because he's my son and I'm not cruel. But the bulk of it is yours. I opened my mouth. She held up one hand. Before you say anything, I didn't do this because I knew he would do something wrong. I did this 8 months before he ever told you about the divorce. I did it because I watched you for 2 years in this house taking care of me without ever making me feel like a burden, and I decided that you were family in the way that actually counts. That's all. I couldn't speak for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside a car drove past. Helen. Drink your tea, she said. The formal charges came in October. Owen was one of 3 associates named in a complaint filed with the LSBC. He'd since moved to a firm in Vancouver following Tessa, who had transferred back. Misappropriation of client funds. The investigation had been going on longer than any of us knew. His license to practice was suspended pending review. I found out through Karen, and then I found out more through the Globe and Mail, which ran a brief item. I read it twice, and then I set my phone face down on the counter and went to check on Helen, who was resting. I stood in her doorway. She was asleep, her book open on the blanket, the photograph of her husband just visible inside the front cover. The cottage in Muskoka. I hadn't even let myself think about that part. Helen's health declined in November. Not sharply, she would have hated anything dramatic, but steadily, the way a light dims rather than goes out. She slept more. She ate less. She told me in one of her clear morning moments that she'd spoken to her doctor and she understood what was coming, and that she had made her peace with it and that she needed me not to make it harder by pretending. I won't pretend, I said. I know, she said. That's one of the things about you. We had a good Christmas. Small, just the 2 of us, and my sister drove up from Brantford with her family for a few days. Helen sat at the table and ate more than she had in weeks and laughed at my brother-in-law's terrible cracker jokes and told my niece, who was 7, that she had very elegant handwriting for her age. My niece beamed for the rest of the day. In late January, Helen asked me to call her solicitor. I sat in the living room while they spoke on the phone, not listening, looking out at the snow on the backyard. When she was done, she called me back in. Just tidying things, she said. She passed on a Thursday in February, quietly in her own room in the night. I was the one who found her in the morning. She looked, I'm not going to pretend otherwise, peaceful, like someone who had decided they were finished. I sat with her for a while before I called anyone. I held her hand, which sounds strange when I say it, but it felt right. She had held mine enough times. The funeral was small. Some of her bridge club, her physiotherapist from the Y, a few neighbors. Owen came. He flew in from Vancouver. He looked diminished, thinner, older, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit the way his suits used to. Tessa was not with him. He didn't speak to me much. At the reception at the house, he stood in his mother's kitchen and looked around at everything like he was trying to find something he recognized. He picked up her tea mug from the dish rack. I'd washed it that morning without thinking about it, just out of habit, and he held it for a second and then set it back down carefully. She was happy here, he said, not looking at me. Yes, I said, she was. He left before it got dark. I watched his rental car back out of the driveway and I felt something I wasn't expecting, not satisfaction, not vindication, just a very tired kind of sadness for the person he had been when I first knew him, before he became the person who packed 2 suitcases and stood in our hallway and said he'd been unhappy for a while. I met with Helen's solicitor in March, the cottage in Muskoka, the registered accounts, a portfolio of GICs she had been quietly building since the 90s. The total was more than I had let myself imagine, not life-changing in a lottery sense, but life-changing in the sense that mattered more, choices, actual choices, for the first time in a long time. I took a week off work and drove up to Muskoka alone. The cottage had been closed for winter and smelled like wood and cold and old blankets. I opened every window. I made coffee on the propane stove and sat on the dock in my coat, watching the ice recede from the shoreline. It was March, still cold, but the kind of cold that is giving up in it, that knows spring is coming. I had not been someone who thought about the future very much. Owen had been the one with the 5-year plans and the investment spreadsheets and the vision boards he never quite finished. I had lived in the present by default, mostly. Sitting on that dock, I started to think forward, not in a desperate way, in a quiet, interested way, like someone turning a page. There was a woman in Helen's Bridge Club. Her name was Donna, in her late 70s, still driving, still fiercely sharp, who had pulled me aside at the reception and squeezed my arm and said, "She talked about you all the time, you know. She said you were the daughter she should have had from the start." I had not been able to respond to that. I just nodded and looked at the floor. But on the dock in Muskoka in March, with the cold and the water and the smell of melting ice, I let myself feel it. What it meant to be chosen. What it meant to be seen by someone so clearly that they rearranged their life around the conclusion. Helen had done that, and I understood, sitting there, that it was the only thing I had actually been asking for a very long time. Not money, not the house, not any of it. Just to be in a room with someone who could see me. I drove home on Sunday. I stopped in Bracebridge for gas and a coffee and stood outside in the sharp March air, and I called my sister. We talked for an hour. She asked me how I was doing, really doing, and I thought about it for a moment before I answered. "I think I'm okay," I said. And then, because it was true, "Actually, I think I'm more than okay." She made me promise to come to Brantford for Easter. I promised. I got back in the car. The drive south on the 400 was clear, that particular kind of early spring clarity where the sky is very blue and the trees are still bare and everything looks a little exposed but also very clean, like something that's been through winter and come out the other side without pretending the winter didn't happen. That's the thing about choosing people, I think. You don't always know what you're choosing. You don't always know what will come of it. You just do the thing that feels right, that feels honest, and you let it be enough. Helen knew that. She'd known it longer than I had. I think I'm starting to catch up. I've thought a lot about why Owen packed those bags so neatly. Not frantically, not guiltily neatly, like he'd been rehearsing it. And I think the answer is that he'd stopped seeing the people around him as people a long time before that night. Helen was a logistical problem. I was a loose end. Tessa was a solution. When you reduce everyone in your life to what they cost you or what they give you, you stop being able to read a room. You stop being able to see what's actually in front of you. He genuinely did not understand what he was handing me when he slid that envelope across the table. He thought he was closing a file. He had no idea he was signing over the most important relationship of my adult life, along with a cottage in Muskoka and 20 years of quietly accumulated GICs. That's not irony. That's just what happens when someone stops paying attention to other people's inner lives. You start making very expensiveness calculations. What I keep coming back to is Helen, not the will, not the cottage, Helen herself. The fact that she had already made her decision 8 months before Owen told me anything. She had been watching, quietly, the way she did everything, and she had reached her own conclusion long before I reached mine. That kind of clarity doesn't happen by accident. It comes from spending a lifetime paying attention to what's real, who shows up, who follows through, who makes you feel like a person instead of a problem to be managed. She had lived long enough to know the difference, and she trusted what she knew. I think about the kind of person I want to be, and honestly, Helen is most of the answer. Not because she was perfect. She had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them, but because she was honest in a way that cost her something. Choosing me over her own son, even quietly, even just on paper, that wasn't easy. It took a kind of moral backbone that I don't think gets talked about enough. The willingness to call a thing what it is, even when it would be more comfortable to look away. And I think about what it took for me to stay, not dramatically, not because I had some grand plan. I stayed because it was the right thing to do and because I genuinely cared about her, and because I had enough sense to know that doing right by someone isn't wasted effort even when it's hard and even when nobody's watching. That's not stubbornness. It's something quieter than that, a kind of steadiness. The decision to keep showing up, to keep being the person you actually want to be, even in a season of your life that feels like it's falling apart at the seams. Owen is living with the consequences of who he chose to be. I don't say that with any satisfaction. I say it because it's simply true. The way most things are simply true when you give them enough time, the choices accumulate. The person you become through them is the person you have to live with. I drove home from Muskoka on a clear March afternoon, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not happy, exactly. Something steadier than happy. Like I had arrived somewhere without realizing I'd been traveling. That's what doing the right thing feels like, I think. Not a reward. Not a door opening dramatically. Just ground under your feet, and the road ahead, and enough light to see by.